Was once a young shepherd boy named Peter. His job was to look after a big flock of sheep for his village. Every day he would herd them out of their barn and up into the hills to eat the fresh green grass. Peter enjoyed his job and he loved the sheep, but he was starting to get a little bored. One morning, Peter awoke as usual and herded the sheep up into the hills. The weather wasn't very nice, so Peter couldn't sunbathe. He'd finished his book, so he couldn't read that either. Feeling naughty, he had an idea to make the day a bit more interesting. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted down the hillside, "Wolf! Wolf! There's a wolf chasing the sheep!" The people of the village heard his screams, leaving their houses and their work to rush up the hillside. "Don't worry, Peter," they shouted back. "We will help to chase it away." When they arrived at the top of the hill, they were confused to see Peter rolling around on the floor, not scared at all. He was laughing at them. "There's no wolf at all," he giggled. "But you all did look funny running up the hill." "Don't cry wolf, Peter," said the villagers angrily. "You've wasted all our time today." They all went back down the hill to get back to work. Peter wasn't finished being bad, though. By midday, the sun still hadn't started shining, and Peter was still bored. He slyly cupped his hands to his mouth again. "Wolf! Wolf!" he screamed. "The sheep are scattering!" The villagers heard his cries again and all started back up the hill. They thought there was no way that Peter would trick them twice. He wouldn't be so rude and silly. They were very surprised when they reached the top of the hill, only to find Peter whooping on the ground again. "How dare you, Peter?" said the villagers. "You are taking advantage of our kind hearts. You can be sure we won't be up here to help you again." Peter just laughed some more. It was worth it to see their funny faces as they puffed and stumbled up the hill for a second time. He couldn't stop grinning at his own jokes as he watched the villagers go grumbling down the hill once more. As the afternoon wore on, the sheep began to nervously shuffle around. Peter could tell something was wrong, but he wasn't sure what it was. Then he saw a big, dark, hairy shadow on the edge of the hillside. It was prowling around the flock. A wolf! A real one this time! All of Peter's sheep began to run in different directions as the wolf pounced. Peter screamed and screamed and screamed. The villagers heard him once again, but just huffed and puffed to each other. "Does he really think we'll fall for that again?" they muttered as they carried on with their work. "He's more stupid than we thought." At sunset, everyone waited to see the familiar sight of Peter herding the sheep back to their barn for the night. It got steadily darker, but Peter still hadn't returned. The villagers began to worry. What if there had been a wolf after all? An old man volunteered to go up the hillside to find Peter. He found him sitting on a rock with no sheep in sight. He was weeping into his hands. "There really was a wolf," he sobbed. "The flock has scattered. I'm so sorry. I pretended. If I hadn't, all the villagers would have come to help me." The old man sighed. "You've learned a valuable lesson today, Peter," he said. "If you lie about something, nobody will ever believe you again, even if you tell the truth." Peter understood that he had taken advantage of the villagers' kind nature. "I'm sure if you came back to the village to apologize, everyone will forgive you," said the old man. So Peter plucked up all his courage and did as the old man said, climbing down the hill and walking home shamefaced. The villagers were happy to see him home safe. "We accept your apology, Peter," they said. A time there lived a vain emperor who thought his clothes and his material possessions were the most important thing in life. He loved to show off his fine suits and robes, sometimes changing his clothes many times a day. The entire kingdom knew about his conceited ways. Two naughty tailors decided they could play a trick on the emperor and steal some of his money. They made a journey to the palace to try and meet with him. The emperor loved to meet new clothes makers, so he invited the two men inside. "We are tailors to many important people," said the men, "and after many years of research, we have invented an amazing new material. It is a fabric so light and fine, with such magical qualities, that it looks invisible to anyone who is not clever enough to appreciate it. We want to make a suit just for you because we know you'll look so good in it." The emperor was delighted by this idea. He would be the first to get such an unusual suit, and he would be able to always know if someone was stupid. He gave the two men a huge bag of gold and told them to get to work immediately. They left the palace laughing with glee. They couldn't believe it had worked. Although they had their money now, they thought they could make this prank go on even longer. A few days passed. The tailors sent word to the palace that they needed to return to take the emperor's measurements. They strode through the grand old doors, pretending to hold huge rolls of fabric and carrying empty bags. "See, your greatness, we have made all this beautiful fabric for you," the tailors said cheerfully. The emperor looked into the bags, but of course could see nothing. A feeling of dread washed over him. Was he too stupid to see the fabric? He realized that nobody else would know. He couldn't see it if he just pretended he could. "Wonderful, beautiful," he said, stroking nothing but the air. All of the staff in the palace began to panic too. Were they too stupid to see the fabric? They decided to follow the emperor's lead and broke out in joyful applause, whooping with delight. "Lovely!" they all cried. The tailors held back tears of laughter. In the emperor's bedroom, the tailors undressed him to drape him in the new fabric. They made a great show of cutting the air with scissors, pushing needles through an invisible cloth, and folding invisible seams. When they were finished, they presented the emperor with a mirror. All he could see staring back was himself in just his underpants. He knew he couldn't stop the deception now. "It's the best suit I've ever seen," he said. Word had spread about the marvelous new fabric, so the palace decided the emperor should give a grand parade. The emperor was worried about going outside in only his underclothes, but convinced himself it wouldn't be embarrassing. After all, no one would notice except those who weren't clever enough to see the fine fabric. He didn't care what stupid people thought. He summoned everyone in the town to come and see the fine new suit. His horses and army lined up outside the palace, ready for the procession. All the people had gathered along the streets, eager to see the finest suit they had heard so much about. Everyone wanted to know who was too stupid to see it, too. The emperor's nude body, rode through the streets in his carriage, standing and waving to all of the people. Too afraid to admit they couldn't see it, the crowd cheered and waved awkwardly. "Amazing! Beautiful!" they cried. In all the crowd, there was only one person not scared to admit the truth he saw with his eyes. "He's only in his underwear," said a little boy. At first the crowd shushed him and reprimanded him for being a silly little child. The boy ran down the streets after the carriage, shouting, He's naked! Doesn't anyone see?" Eventually, the truth began to catch on, as people admitted to their neighbors that they couldn't see the fabric either. A new cry came from the crowd. "The emperor is in his underpants!" The emperor heard their cries and felt very embarrassed. He realized that they were right, and the two tailors had fooled him. He jumped from the carriage and ran back to the palace to hide under his bed. He was so sad that his love of clothes had gotten the better of his common sense. The townsfolk all learned a lesson that day, too. From then on, they weren't afraid to speak up and tell the truth. They understood that truth was the most important thing, even if it seemed stupid. Otherwise, they might find themselves parading through the streets in only their underwear. There was a girl named Cinderella. She was a kind, honest, and sweet person. She was beautiful on the inside, which made her beautiful on the outside, too. Cinderella's mother died when she was a very small girl, and so her father had remarried. Her stepmother was a horrible, mean person. Cinderella and her father had to go and live with her in her old, dusty house. The stepmother's two daughters were just as mean and horrible as their mother, which had made them ugly on the outside. They were jealous of Cinderella's beauty, so they made her wash all their clothes, cook all their food, and clean up all their mess. Cinderella was very unhappy, but she did all her chores without complaining. She dreamed of the day she would be able to leave the awful house and get away from her stepmother and stepsisters. One day a messenger from the castle arrived to the town in a fine black and gold carriage. He brought a letter from the king and queen. "To all eligible ladies of the kingdom, it is the pleasure of the king and queen to invite you to a ball tomorrow night. The prince is ready to be married and is hoping to meet his princess." "Of course Cinderella won't be going," spat the stepmother. "The prince will be looking for a beautiful girl, like my daughters." The stepsisters laughed and agreed. The next evening, Cinderella heard her stepsisters squealing and shrieking as they left to go to the ball without her. "I'm so tired of waiting for the day I can leave this place," sobbed Cinderella. In a flash of blinding white light, a lady with violet hair appeared. Cinderella screamed, "Hush! Do not be frightened, Cinderella. I'm your fairy godmother. You are the kindest, sweetest girl in the entire kingdom, and if the prince were to meet you, you would fall in love instantly. You shall go to the ball. Nobody deserves it as much as you." Bang! A pumpkin in the garden outside grew and grew, changing in color and shape until an exquisite pink carriage was formed. Whoosh! Cinderella's clothes grew longer and fuller until she stood in a fancy white ball gown. Glass as smooth as liquid ran around her bare toes until they were perfectly encased in slippers of pure, clear crystal. Crack! A mouse that had been running through the garden began to swell until a fully grown footman stood beside the carriage. With a warning from the fairy godmother that the magic would wear off by midnight, Cinderella climbed into her carriage and escaped towards the palace. When Cinderella arrived at the ball, the whole room parted to let the mysterious girl pass through, astounded by her fabulous carriage and crystal shoes. the prince saw Cinderella's dazzling dress and silky red hair from his outlook at the top of the ballroom stairs. "That is the most beautiful girl I've ever seen. Footman, please ask her if she would give me the pleasure of a dance." In a private ballroom with golden floors and glowing chandeliers, the prince and Cinderella danced and talked for hours. Although she could not give away her true identity, she dazzled the prince with her charm, cleverness, and lovely face. All too soon, the clocks were striking midnight, and Cinderella gasped when she heard them. She knew the magic would wear off. She ran from the prince's arms, out of the ballroom, and down the red velvet carpet, where one of her delicate glass slippers popped right off. With no time to stop and pick it up, she jumped into her carriage just as the horse began to pull it away. She wept, as she knew she would never be allowed to see the prince again. The prince was upset too, for he could not bear to lose the beautiful girl who knew he wanted to be his wife. Scooping the slipper from the door where it fell, he went out the very next day to find the foot that fit it. After seeing many ladies whose feet were too big or too small, he arrived at Cinderella's stepmother's house. Her sisters went first, trying to stuff their fat toes into the shoes and wailing when they couldn't fit them in. Finally, it was Cinderella's turn. The prince knew right away when he saw her beautiful face turned towards him that she was the one who had danced so gracefully beside him. It was no surprise that her foot slipped daintily into the shoe, a perfect fit. "Cinderella, come away from this place and rule the kingdom as my queen," said the prince. Her many years of toil had come to an end. Cinderella had the happy ending she deserved for being such a sweet and pleasant person. Cinderella and the prince climbed onto the prince's horse and rode back to the palace, vowing to rule the kingdom together as the fairest, most just leaders in all the land. Long, long ago, under the ocean waves, there lived the king of the sea and his 5 mermaid daughters. All of the sisters had beautiful hair and lovely faces, but the youngest mermaid had another special gift. This little mermaid had a beautiful singing voice, which people would come from miles around to hear. All the people who lived and walked around on the land also fascinated the little mermaid. She often wondered how she could get up the surface of the water and live with them, as she thought it would be much more fun. One day, the little mermaid was swimming around near the surface of the water and watching ships go by. She loved to sing for the sailors, who would stretch out over the side of the boat to hear her. Suddenly, she saw a man tumble from the side of a huge ship, falling into the water with a mighty splash. His body floated slowly down into the dark depth of the water. She swam down after him, caught hold of the neck of his shirt, and dragged him to the shore. She watched quietly from the water as other people with legs like his found him lying there amongst the seaweed. She saw them pat him on the back until he coughed up lots of salt water. He was alive! "A beautiful girl," she heard him cry faintly. "She saved me. I know it. Where did she go?" The people on the shore shushed him and told him to save his strength. The little mermaid swam away sadly. She wished that she could stay and tell him that it was her, but knew she wasn't supposed to talk to people with legs. The little mermaid had fallen in love with the young man's face and often thought of him. She knew of a sea witch that lived in the deepest, darkest part of the water. She decided to visit her to see if what she could do to get human legs. Maybe then she could find her young man. The witch said, "I can give you legs, but only if you trade me your beautiful voice." The little mermaid agreed. She didn't need her voice to find the young man, only legs. "There is one condition," said the Sea Witch. "If this man you love marries someone else, you will dissolve into the sea water and become foam on the waves. You can never have a tail or legs again." The little mermaid knew that if she could only find her young man, he would be sure to fall in love with her. So she agreed to that condition too. The witch made her a horrible potion to drink. As the little mermaid swallowed it, everything went dark. She opened her eyes and found herself lying on the beach with the very same young man looking down at her. "Where are you from?" he asked. "I am a prince who was saved by a girl in these waters. I've been looking up and down the sands to find her. Do you know her?" She couldn't believe her luck. The young man had found her, and he was a prince too. She opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came out. The witch had kept her part of the bargain and taken the little mermaid's voice away. The prince didn't mind that she couldn't speak. He thought she was very beautiful, so he took her up to his palace to dry off. The prince invited the little mermaid to stay for a while, and she could only nod vigorously. The little mermaid fell more deeply in love with the prince, and he liked her very much. However, he was saving his love until he found the beautiful girl that rescued him. He still hadn't realized it was the little mermaid, and she had no way to tell him. One day, the prince went to meet the daughter of another king. He was enchanted by her beauty and became convinced that this was the same girl who had rescued him. He asked the princess to marry him, and a grand wedding took place. The little mermaid was heartbroken. On the night of the wedding, she ran crying to the beach, waiting to be turned into sea foam. In the water, she saw 4 heads bobbing above the surface. Her sisters! One of them threw something onto the shore. "Little mermaid," she said, "this is a magic knife from the Sea Witch. We had to give her all our hair to get it from her. She said, if you get rid of the prince with it, then you can come back to us and be a mermaid again." The little mermaid took the magic knife and ran up to the castle, where the wedding had finished. Everyone was sleeping peacefully in their beds. She crept into the prince's room. As she looked down at him sleeping with his new wife, she knew she couldn't use the knife on him. How could she deny him a lifetime of happiness just so she could go back to the sea? It would be so selfish. She knew what the right thing to do was. She went back to the shoreline and waited silently for her fate. As the sun rose, the little mermaid felt a very strange feeling. Instead of dissolving into the sea, she felt herself rising into the air. She traveled high above the land, in amongst the clouds. "Where am I?" she wondered. "Little mermaid, you sacrificed your happiness for someone you loved," they said. "This is your reward. You can live as one of us, as a child of the air, in our beautiful happy kingdom." Finally, the little mermaid had got her just reward for her good soul. She lived happily amongst the fairies in the sky forevermore. Once upon a time, there were 3 bears. They lived in a cozy cottage in the middle of a forest glade. There was a great big father bear, a middle-sized mother bear, and a wee baby bear. Mother bear made a good healthy breakfast of porridge for the bear family every morning. One particular morning, their breakfast porridge was too hot to eat, so they decided to go for a walk in the forest. While they were out, a little girl called Goldilocks came wandering through the trees. She had woken up early and was very bored. She was looking to get into some mischief. When she came across the bear's house, she peered through the windows. She couldn't see anyone inside. Feeling especially naughty, she pushed open the door. In the room was a table with 3 different-sized chairs. One was very large, one was middle-sized, and one was very small. On the table, she spied the 3 bowls of porridge. They were just like the chairs, one big, one medium, and one small. It was getting later in the morning, and Goldilocks was getting hungry. She licked her lips, snuck across the room, and tried out the biggest chair. It wasn't very comfortable. She tried some of the porridge from the big bowl, but it was too salty. Goldilocks jumped off, tried the middle-sized chair instead. This chair was a bit more comfy, but when she tried the porridge, it was far too sweet. Goldilocks hopped off the medium chair and gave the little chair a go. It was very comfy. She slurped porridge from the littlest bowl. Delicious! This chair and this porridge were just right. She ate every last bit of it. After all that munching, she leaned back in the chair. Crack! She had leaned back too far, and the chair broke underneath her. Goldilocks was feeling very full and tired of her mischief, so she went to look for a napping spot. Upstairs, there was a great big bed, a middle-sized bed, and a tiny little bed. She tried out all the beds to see which she liked best. She messed up all the bed covers and sent feathers flying into the air when she bounced on them. The big bed was very hard and far too big. Then she tried the middle-sized bed, but that was far too soft. Lastly, she climbed into the tiny little bed. It was perfect. Goldilocks was soon fast asleep, cozy, warm, and full of porridge. Soon enough, the 3 bears came back from their walk. They saw at once that someone had been in their house. "Someone has been sitting in my chair," growled Father Bear. "Someone has been sitting in my chair," howled Mother Bear. "Someone has broken my chair," squeaked Baby Bear. "And someone has eaten all my porridge." The bears were very upset. Who had broken their things and eaten their food? They didn't know anyone who would be so rude. They were so upset that they decided to go for a lie down. When they got upstairs, they saw at once that their beds had been messed with. Baby Bear began to weep and squeak. Daddy Bear was very angry. "Who's been sleeping in our beds?" he roared. He was so loud that Goldilocks woke up in terror. Father Bear growled very loudly when he saw her head pop up from under the covers, and she was so scared that she jumped right out of the window. Goldilocks didn't make it very far at all. Outside the window, she was caught in the Mother Bear's rose bushes. She cried and wailed as she struggled in the bush. She knew she was about to get into lots of trouble. Father Bear went outside and gave her a good talking to. "See here, girl," he said, "you have broken our furniture, eaten our food, and messed up our beds. What have you got to say for yourself?" "Bears, I didn't think anyone would be upset. I was just bored, and then hungry, and then I was sleepy," said Goldilocks in a sheepish voice. "I'm very sorry if I made you sad." The bears made Goldilocks cook them some new porridge, tidy the beds, and glue the chair back together. She was there all day helping them, but at least she wasn't bored anymore. She learned her lesson. Anything that wasn't hers, she would treat with more respect. She never wanted to get a fright like that again.